Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 6th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maria Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at the University of Oxford, and I am the convener of these seminars. And now let me introduce our speaker today, is Dr. Aliya Kuzhabekova. Aliya is Associate Professor at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, although she's joining us today from Canada. Aliya holds a Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota and works in the field of higher education research. More specifically, Aliya works in 3 main areas. So first area is equity and diversity in education. She has special interest in the experiences of women as researchers, women as leaders in higher education. The second domain of her interest is internationalization and international mobility in higher education. Aliya also studies researcher socialization and research capacity building in higher education. Most of her work focuses geographically on Central Asia and Eurasia, with a particular interest and expertise in the higher education systems of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Last year, Aliya Kuzhabekova received a Leader of Science Web of Science Award in recognition of her outstanding work for publication activity in social sciences. Dr. Kuzhabekova is one of the most cited authors in Kazakhstan. This afternoon, Aliya will present the findings from her comparative study of 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, and Cambodia. It's a collaborative study, and she will tell us more about it, and it looks at the transition of returning scholars to domestic research environments in these countries. I will stop now and pass it over to Aliya. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to see attendees, especially those people that I actually know in real life. I could see some familiar faces. I wanted to express my appreciations to Maya for allowing me to present our collaborative research during this webinar. And I hope to be able to answer your questions. Please stop me if I start to speak for too long a time. So let me share the screen first. As Maya has mentioned, this is the presentation of research that I do collaboratively with my colleagues from Cambodia and Malaysia, in particular Chang Da-wan, who used to be my colleague at Nazarbayev University. He is in Malaysia now, and Kairat Moldashev, who is a Kazakhstani who works in Cambodia. And in particular, they are associated with Paragon International University and University of South Malaysia. And the topic of our presentation, as you know, is comparison of the transition of returning scholars to domestic research environments in Kazakhstan, Malaysia, and Cambodia. The main purpose of our paper was essentially to understand a topic, to make some insights into a topic which is not particularly covered in research and international higher education, and that's to understand the transition of students who received doctoral degrees internationally when they come back to their home countries. And in particular, we wanted to understand how individuals adjust to the research environments in their countries. We also looked at some individuals who pursued postdoctoral experiences after PhD studies. I'm not going to talk about the literature associated with this research because there's a lot in some ways, but not all of this literature addresses the topic directly. Most of the literature on readjustment is focused on undergraduate and maybe master students, not so much on junior researchers. But our main critique with the literature is that prior studies tend to understand the process of reintegration as readjustment, where change happens only within the returning scholar, meaning that it's assumed that there are some structures within the country of origin that create barriers of different sorts for the scholars. And then the scholars, when they come back, it's not the structure that has to change, but the behavior of the scholar who needs. So the scholar has to understand what's happening, how to operate in this new environment for him, and how to change the behavior to be able to conduct research in the new context. This behavior is determined by the structure and accessibility of domestic and international scholarly networks, research governance and funding institutions, academic organization, and cultural norms. What we noticed from our previous study on readjustment of returning scholars in Kazakhstan is that there was an interesting dynamics happening, that the researchers were actually not necessarily trying to adjust to the structure, but they were trying to change the structure also. And then looking for a theoretical explanation for that, we came across the Giddens structuration theory, which essentially argues that the societal structures are not created by themselves. There are agents within the society that initiate new structures, and so that implies that returning scholars should actually have some agency characteristics. They should be able to modify the structures also. So thinking about this theoretical frame, we pose 3 research questions. The first one, at the simplest level, what are the common structural barriers that individuals face when they come back and when they try their research careers? The second question was, what are some of the common agency strategies that individuals utilize across the country context? And the last one was whether there are any unique strategies or unique challenges that individuals face within the particular country context. And these, as you see, are very comparative type of comparative study questions. So because we were interested to understand the central phenomena in depth, that is, we were interested to understand various aspects of the process of adjustment to domestic environment, as well as transformative actions of the individuals. The most appropriate approach in terms of research design was case study, which allows to investigate in depth a contemporary phenomenon within its real life context, citing the founder of the approach, Ian. More specifically, we used horizontal comparative case study design, the design we had in Vavros, where the manifestations of the central phenomena were investigated comparatively across 3 country contexts. And the main method of data collection was interviews. So we collected about 20-25 interviews in each of the countries using maximal variation sampling approach. The main criteria of variation that we were interested in were the country of the country of destination where individuals went to pursue their PhD degrees, their area of specialization, gender, length of experience before their departure to the country of origin, and I mean length of experience working in the higher education settings. And I mentioned the discipline. So there were some other criteria, but these were the key that we are interested to look at further on as we continue to analyze the data, and when we will try to see do some cross-tabulations of the results. The interviews were semi-structured, were conducted in English. However, when we interviewed individuals who studied in countries delivering education in other languages, we interviewed them in the native languages and then translated the transcripts to English. And in terms of data analysis, we use theory-driven thematic analysis within Vivo, and we will look interested only in surface interpretation of the results. So using this particular theory, we thought that even the surface interpretation would allow us to understand, and we had questions that actually asked people about the strategies that they used. So we didn't go into any in-depth qualitative interpretation. We looked only at the surface. So the themes that we retrieved are essentially the themes that all of the participants would agree on if you ask them, or majority of them would agree on. There was a reason why we chose these 3 particular countries. They share some common similarities, and at the same time, there are differences between these 3 countries, which make them interesting cases for analysis. In terms of similarities, all of these 3 countries have post-colonial past. So Kazakhstan was originally part of the Russian Empire, then became part of the Soviet Union, where some people would argue it was also sort of a colony. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is a type of a post-colonial past in Kazakhstan. And in case of Malaysia and Cambodia, they were colonies of France and Britain. In all of these 3 countries, following the overall global discourse of innovation, research-driven economy and international competition, the governments in these three countries are now actively pursuing innovation and competitiveness agendas. And as a consequence, they conduct aggressive reforms of higher education and of research systems, and in particular research systems at universities. And in all of the three countries, there is an increasing emphasis on STEM education. At the same time, in all of the three contexts, there's a very low level, well, not as much in Malaysia, but there's a relatively low level of university research capacity, lack of critical mass of local researchers, especially in the older generations. And in order to address this gap, the deficit of human resources and research staff, all of these countries use internationalization and international mobility as a way to address the problem. So in case of Malaysia and Kazakhstan, there are very large-scale government programs to send students to study abroad. In case of Cambodia, there are lots of scholarships funded by international development agencies and other partners of Cambodia to send Cambodian students to study abroad. Another interesting aspect across all of the systems, which became evident in the process of data analysis, is that in all of them, there is a high influence of informal social networks in the operation of universities, in particular on hiring, promotion, decisions, as well as access to power and resources. So if you want to survive within these systems, it's not sufficient to follow the regular bureaucratic procedures. You also have to understand how informal social networks operate. At the same time, there were differences between the countries. So in Cambodia, in fact, all of these countries can be put on a continuum from the lower level of research capacity to a slightly higher level of research capacity. And this description of key differences essentially present them in this order. Cambodia has the lowest level of R&D expenditure. Interestingly, it has mostly private higher education institutions. And as I mentioned, study abroad is sponsored by foreign partners and donor agencies. And research role has only recently been recognized, and government started to invest more into promoting research capacity at universities. Kazakhstan is somewhere in the middle of these three countries. It has middle-level research and development expenditure, mostly public providers of higher education, study abroad funded mostly by the government, and the discourse of supporting research within higher education context has started to play a greater role about 10 years ago. Malaysia has the highest level of R&D expenditure, a balance between public and private providers of higher education, and in fact, in lots of the universities, right now, a research mission is emphasized more than the teaching mission. And as a result, this country has a very strong publish and perish culture. So here's the results. With respect to the first research questions about some common structural barriers that individuals face across the context, it's clear that in all of these three contexts, when researchers come back, they have very strong motivation to persist, to continue to be researchers, and to make positive changes in the research environment. And in all of these contexts, they confront a harsh reality, which in fact pushes some of them outside the research in higher education and in higher education sector in general. However, those who persist initially have some disenchantment with the system, but then they learn how to cope, and then they learn how to adapt. Some of the common challenges include, first of all, of course, poor research environment. So in many of the institutions, research is perceived as a secondary higher education mission. In Malaysia and Kazakhstan in particular, higher education is focused on teaching. Most of the promotion and salary structures are based on performance in teaching versus research, and that discourages faculty members to conduct research in general. Secondly, there's lack of research relevant social networks. So because individuals are educated abroad, they do not know any of the local scholars, and as a result, they have difficulty establishing partnerships once they come back. At the same time, once they come back, they are isolated from international research community, very often because they lack travel opportunities, specialized funding to go to conferences and to go on short trips abroad. In some cases, they also have poor access to library databases to be even have access to scholarship, global scholarship on their topics of interest. Also, there's a weak domestic research community. So because there's a low critical mass of researchers within their country context, and not merely within their disciplines, but in general, very often returnees are stuck in silos. They have to figure out how to do research without support, without mentorship, and without participation of others. And as I mentioned, there's lack of mentorship opportunities. Another common feature, which was in particularly evident in Kazakhstan and Cambodia, is that there is a possibility for exploitation when individuals engage in international partnerships and also in consultancy opportunities with development agencies. And this, okay, I can probably talk about that when you start to ask questions. If you're interested, I can develop on that topic. Then there are career expectations and salary structures are based on teaching or public service versus research. Also, in all of these contexts, there's high administrative load. And this happens because when returnees come back, very often the administration of universities and the public officials see them as an asset. They have Western education, they understand how Western institutions operate, and they very often want to involve them in administrative responsibilities, which distracts individuals from research as a result. And finally, in all of this context, individuals often experience some hostilities from colleagues and from other domestic researchers. At the same time, there are some common opportunities across these three country contexts. First of all, there is a high perceived value of a foreign degree in all of these countries, and that creates better opportunities to be hired at institutions in some cases. In addition, it creates opportunities to be involved in consultancy projects with international development organizations or with government projects. And also, once you have a better potential in research compared with colleagues in your country, you have better chances to be invited to international collaborations by colleagues from other countries. And another important opportunity is a very high level of satisfaction from teaching and advising that these individuals have once they start their teaching career, because they are very often influencers. They're perceived as influencers by the younger generation of researchers and by graduate students. And they kind of generate a lot of self-confidence from being a role model for this new generation of students. Then if we'll, more interestingly, if we look at the second research question, what are some common agency strategies the individual utilize, we can see that across all three contexts, returnees, first of all, have to overcome as I mentioned, the lack of critical mass of local scholars, and they use some common strategies to do that. Because they don't have access to other well-educated individuals who know how to use research methods, they start to train their own team of scholars from among their master's and PhD students. Of course, that requires access to PhD and master students, and in some contexts, returnees don't have that access because they face hostility from individuals in upper rank who already have reputation within their countries. But once they get hold of the master's and PhD students, they start to train them in their research methods, in their topics. They try to send them abroad to pursue PhD degrees and use them as a broker in the relationship with international partners. Another important strategy is becoming actively engaged in administrative duties. So returnees very often serve as consultants, sometimes on a voluntary basis, to rectors, vice rectors, to ministries of education, and they try to change both institutional and national level research-related policies. In that way, they modify the research context around them. And finally, in all of the three contexts, one of the main strategies is engaging in international research collaborations. For some people, it takes time to establish their own independent research, but once it happens, individuals reach out, they try to participate in international conferences, try to identify other individuals abroad who conduct research on their topics, use these individuals as mentors when mentorship is not available, use connections with these individuals to get access to better research facilities, to conduct experiments, to gain access to research literature, and to, in general, to get new ideas that they cannot get within their own contexts. With respect to the third research questions, I won't talk as much about the differences in challenges, but I'd rather talk about the different strategies that individuals exercise. So within the context of Cambodia, one of the main strategies was engaging in government research agenda setting. And that probably happens because Cambodia is at the beginning stages of changing the research system. It only now that government recognized the importance of developing research at universities. So these new, returning scholars, they try to actively engage with the government to inform the decision making. Sometimes when they can't, they do that indirectly by engaging in partnership or engaging in consultancy projects with international development agencies. In Kazakhstan, and also in case of Cambodia, I saw one interesting case which was not common for other contexts, because I was intentional in some of my questions when I asked in Kazakhstan in particular, I was trying to understand whether there is the process of emergence of early research societies in the country. But then I understood that that's not happening because of the low critical mass of researchers. If you have only like 5-6 physicists in general, to say nothing about physicists, a sufficient number of physicists specializing in a particular theme, it's very difficult for these physicists to organize any sort of research society. And I mean 5 physicists with Western education, because they might be physicists educated in the country context, but then they have different methodological and theoretical approaches. And even if they are interested to reach out to local scholars, they sometimes don't have the capacity to pay membership fees and to support the society. And at the same time, the governments don't realize yet the importance of having local research societies. So what happened, so in Kazakhstan, for example, scholars tried to have these societies, to have some conferences, but then abandoned these attempts within the realms of their own disciplines. But in case of Cambodia, the country which has the lowest research capacity level compared to others, in fact, one of the researchers managed to do that. So, and that researcher was in international and comparative education. So he managed to conduct a conference on the topic within the region, and then using the conference as a platform, created a small research society of international and comparative education of Cambodia, and linked this society with the larger global, international societies. In Kazakhstan, as an alternative to this strategy, what emerged is the Young Researchers Association. So this is something that from my conversations with Russian colleagues, I know is happening in Russia also, but in Kazakhstan, it became the main strategy mostly because the largest body of internationally educated scholars, they are located in Astana, and many of them work at Nazarbayev University. And so Nazarbayev University, having all the it's the world-class research university, world-class aspiring research university with lots of funding from the government, and with a high share of international faculty members, with international level partners from around the world. That creates opportunities for individuals to start new things and to actually reach out to the world, and both domestically and the world. So the young researchers and the returning scholars in Kazakhstan, especially those who didn't manage to land faculty positions and who started to work as postdoctoral fellows or research assistants, who were not able to land positions at local universities at the desired level of salary, or once they gained the positions, they couldn't start their research agendas because of the opposition from older generation of local scholars. They started to mobilize to be able to sort of pave their own way in the system. And so they created this organization based on Nazarbayev University. Then this organization reached out to the rest of Kazakhstan. They interconnected with other returning scholars across the country. They started to conduct their own meetings, which are more like informal meetings where they discuss challenges that they face in the process of doing research and different approaches that they can use to gain government funding or to establish research laboratories and research centers. And they started to use this platform to interact with the Ministry of Education and the Committee on Science in particular. So in the course of time, what I'd say now, from the time when I conducted my original study on Kazakhstan on this topic to now, when I'm interviewing individuals this initiative has actually expanded to the extent that they became main influences of the Ministry of Education. So that the Ministry of Education now actually seeks information and feedback from this organization in implementing changes in research, and lots of modifications in regulations about promotion, about hiring, promotion, and grant distribution were influenced by this group of individuals. In fact, I would say that as a result of lobbying from these individuals, even the composition of the National Research Councils has been changed so that it became more diverse, and it now includes junior scholars, not only all generation of scholars. And in addition, a specialized funding stream was created for junior scholars. And I'm dwelling on this approach a lot because I think this is one of the approaches that could actually be utilized by donor agencies, by scholarship agencies, or by the governments to sort of make more from the capacity of the returnees when they come back by supporting this either junior scholar association or learning societies associations, maybe not national but regional ultimately. But let's talk about that in the recommendation session a little bit later. So in case of Malaysia, I didn't see this research-related agency manifestations as much. But what individuals do try to do, they try to trick the bureaucratic system in order to meet the publish and perish requirement. So sometimes they try to publish maybe in not as reputable journals. Sometimes they try to modify, well, when they file for grant proposals, and there are bureaucratic constraints on the amounts that they can use or in the type of items they can use in the budgets. They play around with the items, including more items that they need, increasing the amount of grant that they actually need, anticipating that the budgets will be cut and the money will be, there will be lots of limitations on how money can be spent. But these to me are minor manifestations of agency that don't change the structure. It's more like adjustment to the structure. Moving to the discussion, the main conclusion that is meaningful from the theoretical point of view is that it's clear from the comparison of these three countries that individuals don't necessarily just adjust to the structures. They actually have, even within countries with the lowest level of research capacity, they have the ability to modify the structure, and and they have this because very often in the context of their countries, they are perceived as change agents. So they were sent abroad with the intention they'll come back and they will change the research and innovation infrastructure in their countries. And then from the practical standpoint, and we actually had a question where we asked individuals what are some of their ideas about what the government and what the institutions need to do to support them. So we gained responses to this idea from the participants themselves, but also some of our reflections about recommendations for policymakers are based on our own insight. So for societal expenditure on education abroad to have a high rate of return, first of all, structural barriers need to be addressed, but also the individuals have to be supported. And some of the most effective ways to do that is to have startup grants. So very often, the agencies that provide scholarships for individuals to go abroad, they support them only during their studies, but it's important to support them after they finished, especially for PhD and postdoctoral type of arrangements. It would be nice if there is some sort of a startup grant that helps individuals to adjust within the first 5 years of their studies when they develop their reputation, when they develop their research agenda. On the other hand, it's important to start helping individuals even in the process of their studies. So if one of the issues is the lack of connections to local social networks, then maybe the donor agencies and the scholarship providing agencies should encourage or should create some mechanism or incentives for students to reach out to researchers in their own countries before they even complete their studies, or to have some sort of mentorship arrangement where a scholar domestically is included in the committees of students when they pursue their PhD studies, so that later on students could rely on this individual to kind of introduce them to the social networks within their countries. I'm finishing up just a second. And okay, and then in another important aspect is since there is a potential for exploitation of these junior scholars across at least two contexts, from what I see, it's important for international partners, whether there are individuals who are collaborating with researchers in non-Western contexts, or institutions, or even donor agencies, to be aware of the fact that there's a potential for exploitation, and to take steps to avoid that, to engage individuals in more meaningful ways, to actually delegate the key responsibility for managing projects and for being the principal investigator on the projects, versus involving them in secondary data collector type of roles or in supportive roles. Anyways, I can talk about this greater length if you're interested in this topic, but I hope, and I also want to say that this is still at the preliminary stage of analysis. We are still at the time of writing individual papers about each of the countries, but I thought this webinar provided me with a good opportunity to reflect about the whole set of data. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions to be able to reflect more about that. Thank you.